Tears in the Darkness. The Story of the Bataan Death March and Its Aftermath by Michael Norman and Elizabeth M. Norman. Narrated by Michael Prichard. Copyright 2009 by Michael Norman and Elizabeth M. Norman. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Farrar, Straus and Giroux, and was produced in the year 2009 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Ghosts. They were stationed far from home when the fighting started, 7,000 miles across the Pacific from San Francisco, in a large archipelago that stretches north and south for 1,000 miles between Formosa and the Dutch East Indies, in the warm tropical waters of the South China Sea. Compared to some of its neighbors, the Philippines, an American possession since 1898, was a bit of a backwater. None of Singapore's sparkle or the hustle of Hong Kong, but the guidebooks of the day called the place paradise, and the books were right. Manila was beautiful, palms leaning gently over the sea wall along the bay, the night filled with the sweet scent of kamyas. Besides its charms, Paradise had the best deep-water port in the Southwest Pacific, and in 1941 that port, that strategic transit point, made the Philippines valuable to the Japanese and American generals and admirals who were furiously preparing for war. A war in the Pacific almost everyone in uniform believed was at hand. On December 8th, 8 hours after it attacked the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Japan sent its bombers and fighters against American air, infantry, and naval bases in the Philippines. 2 weeks later, 43,000 Japanese troops invaded the islands. Waiting for them was a large force of American and Filipino defenders, more than 130,000 men, untried and ill-trained, most of them. The Japanese pushed them back and back again until they were forced to retreat to a small thumb of land on the west coast of Manila Bay, the peninsula of Bataan. There, in jungle wastes and tangled woodlands, they dug trench lines and bunkers, an army of Americans and Filipinos preparing to fight for their lives, the first major land battle for America in World War II. Starting in January 1942, the Japanese took the peninsula under siege and left the Americans and Filipinos cut off from all help and supplies. The two sides fought for 99 days, the Japanese taking horrendous casualties, the Americans and Filipinos falling back under the Japanese assaults from one final defense line to another. At last, on April 9th, sick and starving, without an air force to protect them or a navy to relieve them, the men of Bataan surrendered. More than 76,000 Americans and Filipinos under American command laid down their arms, the single largest defeat in American military history. The sick, starving, and bedraggled prisoners of war were rounded up by their Japanese captors and made to walk 66 miles to a railhead for the trip to prison camp, a baneful walk under a broiling sun that turned into one of the most notorious treks in the annals of war, the Bataan Death March. It is impossible, so the locals say, to walk the ground where this story takes place, the jungles and woodlands and savannas of the Philippines, without feeling the presence, the lingering tenancy of the men who once fought there, Americans, Filipinos, Japanese. Perhaps that is why, at night, Bataanese villagers in their nipa huts often think they hear history stumbling along in the darkness outside their doors. Some nights it is voices they hear, voices begging for food and water, voices pleading for their lives. Other nights it is the sound of shuffling feet, thousands of feet heavy with fear and fatigue, dragging north through the dust mile after mile up the old national road. All of this is memory, of course, the memory of the old ones who lived along the route, or their children and children's children who tell and retell the stories of Bataan as if they were reciting from sacred texts. As the events of 1941-1942 passed into the hands of historians, both the battle for Bataan and the Death March became symbols, the former as a modern Thermopylae, a stirring last stand, and the latter as a crucible of courage, the courage to continue on a walk to the grave. In some sense these conceits were true, but when the dross of propaganda and myth is skimmed from the surface of history, what's left, in this case, is an example of the miscarried morality and Punic politics that underlie every appeal to arms. The bad leadership, the empty promises, the kind of cruelty that crushes men's souls. Proof, too, that the instant the first shot is fired, the so-called rules of war, guerre de règle, give way to guerre à outrance, war without clemency or quarter. So much suffering leaves any piece of ground spectral. Little wonder, then, the locals along the road hear voices, and the survivors of that battle and march, old men now, keep the company of ghosts. Ben Steele came of age as a cowboy, or an echo of a cowboy, which in his time, the early decades of the 20th century, was probably the same thing. He grew up in a pine-log house by a crystal spring in the shadow of the Bull Mountains on Montana's eastern plain. By the time he was 8, he could ride, rope, and shoot. He herded cattle. He drove horses. He tended sheep. Alone at night on the open range, he slept in a circle of rope to keep the snakes out of his bedroll. In 1940, just before his 23rd birthday, he joined the Army Air Corps and was shipped to the Philippines to fight the Japanese. After 99 days of battle, he became a prisoner of war and spent 3 years behind barbed wire and watchtowers. Every day he was starved or beaten by his keepers, the Bug, Mickey Mouse, the Killer. He never forgot those faces. They insinuated themselves in his psyche, permanent residents now, along with wild mustangs, sheep-herders, ambling cowboys, and antelope gamboling through the sage. This is all in his sketchbooks. The sketchbooks are stacked on shelves and in closets, black buckram and hardbound, most of them. They date from his first days in art school, more than 30 volumes of trials and exercises, 61 years of sketching and painting every day, searching for the perfect line, the exact color, the proper balance and emphasis, proportion and perspective. At 90 years plus, a lifetime of trying, as artists say of their work, to get the thing right. On occasion he works from models in a studio or tramps out to the prairie to sketch a scene. He likes to draw horses. He hasn't been on a horse in nearly 25 years, but his respect and affection for the animals run deep. Back to the blizzards of his boyhood, when his horse would lead him through a blinding whiteout, back to the safety and warmth of the pine-log house at Hawk Creek. By and large, however, the leaves of his sketchbooks hold his ghosts, page after page of prisoners of war and the imperial Hohe who guarded them, the men who held Ben Steele captive for 1,244 days. He cannot say why, after 6 decades, he still sketches the faces that followed him home from the camps, the faces of old comrades in prison rags, and the faces of the Japanese soldiers who herded them from place to place and kept them penned behind barbed wire. These ghosts pop up everywhere in his sketchbooks, sometimes like rogues in a gallery, but as often as not singly in quick profile or thumbnail, sometimes on the same page with bucking mustangs and cow-ponies, or, like interlopers, peering in from the edges of landscapes, intruding on the cottonwoods and sage. In the early sketchbooks, the ones he filled after the war while attending college and during his first decade as a professor of art, the drawings of his keepers and his comrades tend to be imitative, realistic, the faces filled with the meanness and misery of war, as if the artist's aim was to document his experience. After a certain point, however, 10 years post-battle, perhaps 15, the drawings become simpler, less emotive. No longer are the faces rendered with the kind of shading and cross-hatching that create tone and mood. Most are simple line drawings in pen and ink, quirky enough to qualify as caricature. In his later work, the prisoners look more hapless than hopeless, hobos in bedraggled dress, and the guards appear more often than not as comic grotesques, a little lunatic, or just plain goofy. This is perspective and proportion of a different sort, and it has nothing to do with either the geometry or the grammar of art. Ben Steele, brown eyes aglint, almost always wears a smile, like a man who knows he finally got the thing right. Chapter 1. He enlisted on the advice of his mother, Bess. In the late summer of 1940, Ben Steele was working as a camp tender at a large sheep outfit east of town. It was hard, sometimes filthy work, but the freedom of it made him happy. On his own every day, riding a horse or driving a rig between the far-flung camps of the sheep herders, delivering mail and supplies, sleeping in the open, wrapped in an oilcloth, staring up at a big sky dark with bright stars. One weekend that summer, Ben Steele's mother and father drove out from Billings to visit. His mother had an idea. He'd been a ranch hand most of his life, she said. He was 22 now, grown up. Maybe it was time to consider something else. She'd heard on the radio that President Franklin D. Roosevelt had just signed a law creating the first peacetime military draft. The inaugural call-up, she said, was scheduled for late October. "You know, I've been thinking," she went on. "You really ought to get in before they draft you. Maybe if you do, you could, do what you want in the Army." He wasn't sure he wanted to wear a uniform, but since he usually took his mother's advice to heart, he tucked her suggestion away. And a while later, over a smoky campfire, perhaps, or riding the green hills and valleys, he remembered something. The boys he knew from Billings who had enlisted in the Army were usually sent west for training to the golden valleys of California. He thought, going to California, that sounds good. A little adventure. And on a nice warm day in mid-September, he borrowed a car, went into town, ambled over to the Stapleton building on 28th Street and into the recruiting station there, where he found a sergeant sitting at a desk. "I want to go into the Army," he announced. "Well, now," the recruiter said, looking up at the lean ranch hand standing in front of him, "we have the Army and we have the Army Air Corps. Which one you want?" Ben Steele knew nothing about soldiering, but some years earlier a couple of fellows up at the Billings Municipal Airport got themselves a Ford trimotor, a propeller under each wing and one on the nose, and for $1 a head started taking people for a ride. It wasn't much of a ride. The plane took off from atop the rim rocks, circled the Yellowstone Valley below, and a few minutes later landed to pick up another load of wide-eyed locals. But that short hop stirred something in Ben Steele. "The Air Corps," he said. "That sounds real good. Give me that." A few weeks later, on October 9th, 1940, a month shy of his 23rd birthday, Ben Steele stood in a line of enlistees at the United States Courthouse in Missoula, Montana, raised his right hand, and repeated one of the Republic's oldest oaths. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign or domestic. So help me God. Like everyone else, like every American who read the newspapers, listened to the radio, went to the movies, and watched newsreels, Private Ben Steele of the United States Army Air Corps was convinced his enemies would be German. Japan was a threat, all right. That fall, in fact, America cut its shipments of scrap steel and iron to Japan. But Germany, threatening all Europe, was the menace of the moment. The Germans had invaded Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. By the time Ben Steele arrived at the induction station in Missoula in the fall of 1940, the German Luftwaffe had been bombing Great Britain for 3 months. Reading about all this in the Billings Gazette or listening to it on KGHL radio, the most popular station in that part of the West, most Montanans wanted no part of the trouble overseas. Like the rest of America, they were focused on finding jobs and recovering from the Great Depression, not crossing swords with the saber-rattling Germans. In a national opinion poll conducted the week Ben Steele enlisted, 83% of those surveyed said they did not want to send American troops overseas. Young men looking for a job or a little adventure don't pay much attention to opinion polls. The Army was offering a paycheck, plus 3 hots and a cot, and perhaps a chance to travel. Since they had no feel for the killing and dying in Europe, no sense at all of facing Panzer tanks and Stuka dive bombers, the ranch hands, soda jerks, delivery boys, and railroad workers on their way to training camp with Ben Steele were full of brio and eager for action. If war's going to come, I want to be in it, Ben Steele thought. Hell, I want to be over there where it's happening. Saturday, October 4th, 1941. San Francisco. Blue sky, bright sun, 72 degrees, a good day to set sail for paradise. On a pier off the Embarcadero, the men of the 19th Bombardment Group, United States Army Air Corps, waited in long queues to board the United States Army transport General Willard A. Holbrook, a lumbering troop ship used to ferry men and materiel to American bases overseas. In the ranks on the wharf, moving slowly toward the gangway, was Benjamin Charles Steele, serial number 19018-989, a newly minted private. He had been in uniform nearly a year now, and he liked the life of a soldier. The Army had given him just what he wanted, a chance to cross the mountains and see the golden land. California wasn't as golden as he'd imagined, but he liked it well enough. Training camp was a dusty tent city on the dry brown flats at March Field near Riverside. The boys from the cities and suburbs thought these accommodations kind of primitive. But the men who had been ranch-raised looked around and saw luxury. Tents with wooden floors and gas stoves, hot showers nearby, latrines that weren't buzzing with flies, and a mess hall that served seconds if a man wasn't sated. Air Corps basic training was short, just 6 weeks, long enough for men who would be working as airplane mechanics, gunners, ground crews, and supernumeraries. They attended classes on military courtesy and discipline. They reviewed Army rules and regulations. They endured hours of close-order drill and the ritual of forced marches. These little walks, as Ben Steele thought of them, were too much for many of the men. After one 8-mile hike, the road was lined with recruits doubled over, gasping for breath and grousing about their training. Ben Steele had never heard such belly-aching. "Holy Christ," he said, to no one in particular, 8 miles is nothing. Back home I'd walk that far before breakfast." "Oh, yeah?" one of the malcontents came back. "Where the hell did you come from?" "I'm from Montana," Ben Steele said. The Army sent him to New Mexico after basic training and assigned him to the 7th Materiel Squadron, 19th Bombardment Group, Kirtland Field, Albuquerque. As soon as he was settled, he made inquiries about buying a horse. A local stockman wanted $50 for an old plug named Blaze. Not much of a horse, nothing like the spirited animals he was used to. But he missed riding. So he went to a finance company, borrowed the money, agreeing to pay $5 a week against the balance, and made a deal with a nearby rancher to pasture his mount. His father shipped him a saddle, and every weekend Ben Steele rode out among the cactus and scrub grass. It was hot, sandy country, but he didn't care. He was on a horse, and a horse reminded him of home. The Air Corps made him a dispatcher, tracking flights, and after a month or two of this work he got it in his head that he wanted to be a pilot. Never much of a student, he found a math professor at the University of New Mexico to tutor him privately in the algebra and geometry that he would need to pass the exam to become a cadet. He studied for several months and was about to take the test when word came down that the 19th Bombardment Group was being sent overseas. "You can't ship me out," he told his commanding officer. "I'm fixing to take the cadet exam." "Oh, yeah, we can," the squadron commander said. "The whole outfit's going." October 3rd, 1941. Dearest Mother and Family, thought would drop you a few more lines before departing the U.S. I'm sailing tomorrow afternoon. We don't know for sure how long we will have to stay in foreign service, but hope it isn't too long. But it may be all right. Will write you every chance I get so you will know where I am at. Just heard we were going to the Philippines, but that is just a rumor, not certain. Can't believe a thing you hear around here. Don't worry about anything, because everything is okay. Will write as soon as I can make connections. It is possible we will stop at some port along the way, and if we do, we'll send you a line. Lots of love to you all. Bud. America remembers the attacks on its bases in the Pacific in 1941 as acts of treachery. But to label them sneak attacks is more propaganda than plain truth. For more than 20 years, a standing committee of admirals and generals in Washington had been planning against just such an attack. They looked at Japan as America's chief antagonist in the Pacific, and they knew well the value of surprise and Japan's history of success with this tactic. The military planners were sure that when war came, it would begin with a sudden surprise attack. They did not know exactly where or precisely when, but they were convinced that the Philippines, just 1,800 air miles from Japan and sitting directly between it and the oil and mineral-rich Indonesian archipelago in the southwest Pacific, would top Japan's list of targets. So in the early fall of 1941, with war consuming Europe and with the Japanese army on the march in Asia, American war planners, more in an attempt to deter an attack than defend against it, began to rush cannon, tanks, airplanes, and men to the Philippine Islands. The men of the 19th Bombardment Group, United States Army Air Corps, were part of that consignment. The Holbrook set sail on the evening tide that October 4th. In the ship's galley, cooks had prepared a greasy ragout of pork, and as the men passed through the mess line, stewards slopped the dinner on their trays. Later that night the wind picked up, the waves began to swell, and the Holbrook began to pitch and roll. And it wasn't long before all that greasy pork began to reappear. Soon the crappers were clogged and the sinks were overflowing. October 10th, 1941. Dearest Mother and Family, have been sitting out on the deck this morning watching flying fish. They are about 6 inches long and sail through the air like a bird. The water has been sort of rough all the way. The ship is bobbing up and down and from one side to the other till I can't even sit still. I'm sitting here on the deck and writing on my knee. Hope you can read this. After Hawaii, the sailing was easy, flat water most of the way and light tropical breezes. Most men spent mornings topside, watching the water or staring at the horizon, absorbed by the vast vista of the sea. Some played cards on the hatch covers or spread out their towels and baked in the afternoon sun. In the evenings, Quentin Pershing DeVore of East Colorado came topside to listen to his Hallicrafter shortwave radio. One evening, a dark-haired fellow with a friendly face eased over and sat down next to him. "I'm Ben Steele," he said, holding out his hand. "I'm Pershing DeVore. What do you get on that thing?" the fellow asked. "I get the news. Sometimes I get music," DeVore said. DeVore, too, had grown up outdoors, working the land and livestock in the rye and wheat farming country of Yuma County, a day's drive or so from the Nebraska border. He considered himself a plain boy with no frills, and that's how this fellow from Billings struck him, too. Real plain. "Where did you get that name, Pershing?" Ben Steele asked. "Well, my name is Quentin Pershing DeVore, but they call me Pershing." "That's too complicated," Ben Steele said. "I'm just going to call you QP." October 18th, 1941. Dearest Mother, Dad, and family. Met a new friend. He likes hunting and fishing about as well as I do. We get together and talk over old times. It sort of makes me feel at home. They talked for hours about farming and ranching and cattle and sheep, about the hard-up life on a Colorado farm and the hard-scrabble days on a Montana homestead. Ben Steele often turned the conversation to horses, cow-ponies, broncs and quarter horses, chestnuts, Appaloosas, and bays. QP thought, "This guy is crazy about horses." They talked about war as well. Their convoy was flanked by destroyer escorts, and at night the ship was blacked out, a shadow on the sea. A week and a half out of Hawaii, their company commander called them together. They were going to the Philippines to fight a war, he said. Thursday, October 23rd, 1941, Pier 7, Manila, Philippines. Assembled on deck, the 1,300 soldiers of the 19th Bombardment Group were preparing to greet paradise. Down the pier, a line of trucks was waiting to take them north to their billets at Clark Field, a lattice of sand and turf runways laid out on a hot, dry plain 50 miles northwest of Manila. As the young Americans made their way down the gangways and ladders to the queue of open trucks, they were wide-eyed with wonder and delight. October 24th, 1941. Was sure glad to get off the boat after being on it for so long. We were as dirty as a bunch of hogs when we landed. It is sure interesting around here. The natives are as thick as bees and live in little bamboo shacks. Drive little horses about the size of a good-sized dog, hitched to a little cart. Some have oxen, carabao, hitched to old wooden-wheeled carts. Sure is interesting to watch them. They are always trying to sell us something. They are running from one barracks to the other trying to get a job making our beds and shining our shoes. Would hate to think I was so lazy I couldn't make my own bed. We have to have mosquito nets over our beds at night so we can sleep. The mosquitoes here are like hummingbirds. Don't worry about me because I never felt better in my life and I'm having a swell time. So please don't worry. This will be one of the greatest experiences of my life. For decades, the Philippines had been a backwater post, a collecting pool for those on the way up, young officers eager to get their tickets punched for promotion, and those on the way out, the deadwood, the drunks, the disappointed who had been passed over for rank and were now holed up in a quiet billet, waiting to put in their papers and take a last parade. It was a gorgeous backwater. Manila was known as the Pearl of the Orient, and parts of the city, especially the precincts where the Americans and Europeans lived and worked, looked like arboretums. Along the boulevards, the trees were trimmed.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?